Well, welcome. My name is Eric Dewar. We're recording one of the podcasts associated with our Honors Humans and the Evolutionary Perspective course. I'm associate professor in the Department of Biology, and I'm here with three students from the Honors program.
Hello, my name's LaQueen. I'm a junior. Hope you enjoy.
Hi, I'm Christina Payne. I'm a senior. I also hope you enjoy.
Hi, my name is Madison. I'm a junior and enjoy.
So, we've been reading a book by Daniel Stamos that's called Evolution and the Big Questions. And what each of the chapters kind of covers a different aspect of human biology or humans are like to try to understand how that maps onto what we understand about evolutionary theory, or are there other explanations, say like the standard social science model, that might be better explanations for them. The chapter that we read as a group is the one about sex and evolution. So this covered a bunch of different things related to, say, a lot of stuff related to sexual preference, the prevalence of rape as an adaptation or not, or just or also just what humans find attractive in other people. So yeah, maybe we should start off with just like the attractiveness part. What are some of the arguments that he made about, what men and women are looking for?
One thing that I found is a lot of what he said was attractive towards men, specifically, well, actually, all men, is a woman's ability to bear a child. And he said that a lot of physical features that would kind of demonstrate someone who's able to properly bear a child as being full of figure, like rosy cheeks, full lips, which I've never heard of rosy cheeks and full lips being a proper justification of bearing a child properly. And so just like things that are supposed to be making a woman attractive. And I found that also very interesting because that those things are what women aspire to be. They aspire to have full lips, to have like proper complexion, to have a certain figure. Like the hourglass figure is ideal. Like wider hips for childbearing, which I found pretty interesting.
Yeah, these are all these. There are lots of stimuli that come in to our brains. Some of them that were going to cause particular behaviors. We call them releasers. So yeah, so sometimes it's going to be whether it's going to be about height or about figure. Those are things that trigger certain buttons in the brain, I guess. But what are all those features like? What do they all have in common? Those different, so the particular visual attributes. What are they signaling about a person?
A person's fertility, I believe, was what the main argument was, because it was all about in that certain age of youth when someone is able to start bearing children to when they can cease bearing children at menopause, was when they were considered to be most attractive by their male counterparts. So therefore, that's the whole reason of why the attraction, or according to the evolutionary argument, because that would be when the like success of offspring would be highest, would be when a female exhibited those traits, whereas males can still produce sperm up until their 80s, 90s. They could still technically conceive offspring, and they have. Women have more of a like fertility time limit, and so I believe that's why that was more considered an attractive trait. And on the other hand, with women, their like most attractive trait in a man was socioeconomic status, which I also loved the evolutionary argument for that, which was that those are the people that are going to be able to care for the offspring, or provide the most resources for the offspring. Yeah.
Do you buy that as an argument?
A little. I think it delves a bit more into cultural bias in that way, because I think from such a young age we are taught that instinctually you want to have resources for your child. I get that. But socioeconomic status and a sign of stability is kind of bred in and taught as such a like really important thing, something that you want to covet and have regardless of your gender. And so I think there is a little bit more cultural bias to that than there is to the male attraction. But it does seem to be decently supported.
Anything you want to add on that, LaQueen, as far as what else, any of the attributes of the either male or female preferences that we didn't talk about?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I definitely like related back to like our cultural standards and how like there's so much like makeup and like the standards of like women beauty and how like they have this tendency to cover up make like their wrinkles or things like that, and like for men it's so much more different, like how like men found attractiveness like to be a priority over women who like prioritize like social economic status and stuff. And I also wanted to like hit upon like I think for this part I read that he talked about like paternal confidence and stuff like that, and yeah, I just felt that like the fact that women will like most like they know that the baby is theirs type of thing. Meanwhile,
They assume.
yeah, men like this part where they cover that men may feel more upset by like things like sexual like infidelity because like they're not sure, because like the sexual intercourse for males like take a few minutes and stuff like that or so, but for women it's like a long-term process. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That was, yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit in class, that remember the sex that puts more energy into reproduction is the one that chooses the mates, right? So whether that, and that's reversed in some kinds of animals that I think he brings up in this, but yeah, it's whoever's bringing more energy or time or like it's going to take a different chunk out of their lives. Those are the ones that tend to be the choosy ones. But yeah, the difference between how men and women perceive infidelity, how it's which one was it? Males are more upset by sexual infidelity and women with emotional infidelity, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
thought that, building off of Queen, I thought that like gave a lot of support to the, what was it called? Paternity confidence. Because if a woman is having sexual infidelity, then there's that uncertainty of who the offspring really belongs to, which I thought was a really interesting argument that I hadn't really considered before. But that idea of now you're not sure of what, if the child is yours or if it isn't yours. Whereas, and I got a little bit, I didn't fully agree with this argument, but females were more upset by emotional infidelity, which I figured would be true, than by sexual infidelity. But the argument was that since emotional infidelity is much more threatening to the loss of economic support, they would be more upset about that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I think that's true.
Why?
Because it's just, I don't know. That doesn't make as much logical sense to me. Like, I understand the possibility of having a lack of resources all of a sudden, and how that could be potentially upsetting. But I don't know. The argument works better in the idea of there was that psychological study that was done and about how women were preferring and like seeking long-term mates.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not necessarily socioeconomic and resource driven, but the fact that they would have considered this a long-term mate and then them having emotional infidelity would suggest otherwise, I think would be more of a cause for upset than like, oh, I'm going to lose some like resource access. But the paternity confidence in men did make sense to me.
One thing going off of that argument, something that I saw out of that was for females, it wasn't like the emotional aspect was more of a lack of stability.
Mm.
And for the male, it was more of a lack of, for lack of a better word, like dominance. No, I don't want to say dominance.
Well, it's access. It's like access
Access or possession over possession.
It's access to like opportunities to breed, right?
Yeah.
So it's then directly related to fertility.
Because something that like this article touched on is a male mainly seeing a woman as kind of an see this article, it went back and forth on like a male thinking that a woman is an object and then going back and being like, well, not really. And so I'm trying to be very careful about my words. Like for a male in this article, I would see it as the man not being emotionally invested, given the statistics that he was saying, which isn't always true. Not emotionally invested, but more physically invested, and having that piece of that woman being at their disposal for intercourse always. And I don't know. I'm trying to.
No, that's definitely the way it was phrased in there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think what it was, it's like he really put out in the article that like women tend to be more emotionally invested, so like men might take it as a hit to like the commitment in the relationship. And I know he had said like that when they did the survey with the college students that like the male participants like said that loyalty and like was very important to them. And I think when it comes to infidelity, like because of the fact that he laid out, like especially like men tend to be more interested in short term like mating than women. Women take it like less personal because they have that type of like image, I guess. And when it came to like women like cheating, like it said that it led like to a higher rate of like divorce and separation. Like there was more like consequence behind it almost.
Yeah. Well, I liked the explanation that he had for the whole long-term versus short-term, and it has to do with the amount of investment that's going into intercourse. For men, it's a matter of minutes of investment. For women, I mean, we have birth control and such now, but those didn't exist previously. The investment was potentially like 9 months and then a child. So it was like the idea a little bit of men could prefer a short-term mate because their investment is so small, whereas women understanding the consequences and understanding the result, that's a 9-month investment for them.
Right, but on the other hand, if women, women are the reason why women are choosy for guys with a higher socioeconomic status is because that's starting to like even the scales.
Yeah.
So so males, so yeah, maybe they're not putting as much investment into the act of reproduction, but their investment comes in like the rest of the other 40 hours a week when they're working. To use kind of that argument. So I think that's why he's making that case there.
No, and I hear you, but I think that goes along with why women are more choosy about it being a long-term partner. Because if that were to happen, they want someone that's going to stick around.
Mm-hmm.
Someone with higher socioeconomic status is more likely, you'd think, to have the resources to stick around for that investment they created.
I wonder how many of these conclusions are getting messed up by what his sample was. I love that. I've actually wrote in the margin of my book. I said that, because most of these studies are studies of college students.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's my target demo. But I wonder how it would be different though if we're thinking, because, I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to make any assumptions. But if somebody's, do you think that the way that college men and women think about pairing up is the same as like an old person like me? Do you think that there's like, because if there's having a mate, but then there's like having a good boyfriend, are those different things?
I would say. I mean, he even touches on that in the article that maybe having the target of college students not being completely accurate, because like as a college student, your life is always changing, and you are still dependent on parents for the most part. So you don't really know. Well, not a lot of college students know pure independence. Of course, there's the exception. But, like, I feel like it would be incredibly difficult to be able to fully invest an entire lifetime with somebody in a college stage because you're not even able to fully grasp what your life after college can be.
I just started doing laundry 18 months ago.
So just the idea of thinking about the next couple or the next 50, 60 years of your life
Yeah.
is just, I don't know.
And of course, it's the college age women that are right in the pocket of this age that's most desirable for most guys. So that's the other thing that I almost wonder if when you survey college students, you're interacting with people who where women are at in some ways they're like the apex of their bargaining for a mate, whereas the males are completely they're all basically any college dude is like low socioeconomic status. If you're talking about him as negative $1,000 for tuition, so it almost seems like it's almost like not like a fair fight, But there's no perfect time to ask everybody how it works, I guess.
And it's also funny how they bring that up, that a lot of the time it's the younger woman seeking out the older man, so just for that economic status probably. So, I mean, that definitely makes sense. But something also interesting is they barely touch on the idea of a younger man wanting an older woman.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they go into the idea of, like, supposedly it's not desirable, but that's definitely a thing.
They referenced it as sort of like an exception. It was weird. They pulled that type of preference. I don't know where exactly it is, but they were discussing it.
Mm-hmm.
And they were just kind of like, well, we're going to call that the exception. And I believe the analogy they made was the idea that we know smoking can cause cancer, but, someone will pull up this person who lived to 90-something who smoked a pack every day. And so they threw that in as, like, the younger male seeking an older female. They were considering that the, like, outlier.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that I found a common theme is that this is very scientific and they try their very best to pull out statistics, but it's very narrow in the sociology view. And I'm a sociology student, so going through this, like, half of my notes are like, you're not thinking about this on a broader scale. You're thinking about this as a very statistical matter. And, like, we'll go into it, but there were a lot of errors that I found when they were talking about the rape subject.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Agreed.
just the idea that, like, for the listener and for a future reader, I would just be like, be very careful in taking everything that they're saying as, yes, it may be truth statistically, but there's always more to the statistics.
I think the author tried to address that, though. I mean, maybe
Oh, yeah.
not as well as could have been done, but he did consistently say there are limitations. I wish these hypotheses had been tested cross-culturally. He cites that a lot, particularly with the female-to-male sexual attraction. It becomes less of a cross-cultural thing as he delves into, like, rape and homosexuality. But he does mention it quite a bit, that there's not, the sample is very narrow.
Do you want to talk about this some more, or you want to try one of the other topics that are in it?
I'll check my notes first.
Yeah, sure.
I think the next topic is rape.
Yeah, that's right.
Cheerful in the morning.
Yeah, I know it totally is, and again, the target demographic, really does seem to be, basically high school, college age women. Is basically the way, I can't remember the exact way that he's phrased it, but that's the what would appear externally to be like the most fertile 10%, people at that part of their lives. Yeah. So what does he write about that?
A lot of conflicting stuff is what he writes about.
Yeah.
So one of the things that he initially got discussed or got sort of debunked, and I could tell the author was uncomfortable writing this and I'm uncomfortable repeating it, but the idea that rape is seen as a violent crime, but they had all these statistics to show that, like, as minimal of violence as could be used as possible was what was typically used. I hate myself for saying this out loud. And so the idea of rape becoming a sexual act and a sexual adaptation rather than a violent or aggressive one was a really interesting argument. Like, it was kind of hard to stomach because it is, so violent and so culturally taboo and something that we just associate with, like, horror. But it made sense that in, like, the goal with rape was not to murder or to injure. It was to use for a sexual experience. And that's still not okay, but that and its reflection in the animal kingdom of unwilling sexual participants and it not being about necessarily dominating the female gender.
Not emotionally. Yeah.
Emotionally, but about something physical. I thought that argument had a lot of support.
Because it's cheating on the socioeconomic argument.
Exactly.
So basically it says it's sex for free as opposed to having to actually participate in a dance.
Exactly.
Marla Queen, what did you think about that part?
Yeah, there was definitely like a lot in it. Especially where he talks about like how rape is an adaptation because it increases like reproductive success and like I didn't know how I felt about that because I referenced Giglieri. Is that how you pronounce it?
I don't know. You're probably right.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
He says that rape is a result of male failure to provide resources and status, and he calls it like the short-term mating strategy. And I felt like it was almost just like not an appropriate way of viewing it because like simply because you're not like wanted by a woman, I don't think people in society automatically jump to rape as like an outlet for that. And he was saying how this was supported by like how men may like rape during war because like they feel that their time here might be limited, so they like need to reproduce or things like that. I just feel like it wasn't like rape isn't an adaptation necessarily like as an outlet just because they feel like they can't provide.
Yeah, no, I agree a little bit. I think the reason why this part of the chapter got so uncomfortable to read, well, A, it's already an uncomfortable topic,
Sure.
but B, calling it an evolutionary adaptation, even if there's significant support, I think feels like an excuse. And I think it makes us uncomfortable to try, like, and it's not, and I don't think the author is trying to frame it in that way. It's not an excusable behavior, and I think when we try to, like, it almost feels like we're rationalizing it, and I feel like that's why it gets so uncomfortable and so, like, like, I don't want to agree with this or what's being said.
How would you decide if it were an adaptation or not? Like, if this were not people, if this were something else, how would we decide if any kind of behavior were an adaptation?
Does it increase the fitness?
Yeah, so if it does increase fitness, so does it end up with more genes the next generation?
Yeah.
And so I agree with you. I think we're all in agreement that just as humans, of course, we're talking about something that's terrible.
Yeah.
But and yet it does sound like excusatory kind of language, the way that it's framed.
Yeah.
But can we, as human beings, we can agree that it's terrible. But yeah, is it an excuse to say that it's an adaptation, or is that a case where a scientist would say, "Look, I'm just saying it's going to increase fitness. That doesn't. Don't make me the bad guy." And so, is there a graceful way for a scientist to talk about this as it being potentially an adaptive behavior without making it sound like you're making excuses or that's sounding like making excuses?
No, I think it's hard to talk about without it sounding like it being rationalized because we are looking for an explanation, and so that's kind of how it works. The closest I got to to getting it and not feeling so like this is kind of just an excuse is when when he was citing all the statistics about how the majority, like the vast majority of rapes are committed by men, and the vast majority of the victims are women in that prime fertility period.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a statistic that I think is really hard to argue with from an evolutionary standpoint.
Yeah.
And I don't think it excuses the behavior at all, but I think maybe it does give an explanation for not necessarily like why the behavior is occurring, but explaining like the victimology and the perpetrator more than the behavior itself being like an adaptation.
Yeah. I think it does help us to think about where we should be contributing resources so that we can minimize it, so that we can make it as much of a deterrent as possible. Because, there's a difference between an urge as opposed to what's going to be acceptable behavior. And we have to, so I think that, if the result of this is, this is an unavoidable urge that's caused by biological impulses, what are things that we can do with the law? What are things that we can do with our societal norms that are going to minimize it, to kind of save us from our, get us more on the side of the angels? I wonder if that's the only thing that we can really use this for. Because otherwise, and also, I would say one thing I didn't say at the beginning was people who study sexual behavior, sexual morphology, are at a real disadvantage compared to a lot of other kinds of scientists, because it's, if I said, if you're somebody who looks at fossils or you look at DNA or something, then that's, people get that. But people who are interested in sexual behavior are already out of the gate seen as a little bit weird. So their work has to be done kind of in secret, or at least it's not, when it gets in the news, it's sort of the jokey, hey, look at this necrophiliac duck, duck rapist. Like that kind of stuff makes news and we laugh about it. But there's part of the reason why, I think Americans in general, but also humans, Americans in particular, humans in general, the reason why our knowledge about how our bodies work sexually, or how that affects the way that we relate to one another, comes from a lot of the fact that it's just hard to do this research in like daylight. Like Kinsey was only mentioned like once in this chapter, and when it wasn't about these kinds of behaviors. So I think that, and even that was all that stuff was done was done not in public for decades, and so there's actually a really wonderful book by an author named Mary Roach. It's called Bonk. It's about kind of the scientific study of sex. Mary Roach has a lot of really great science books that are intended for the layperson, that are all kind of equally sort of newsy. But anyway, the point is that one of the things I got out of reading that book was that there's almost this camaraderie that comes from people who study science in a sexual sense. Sorry, sex in a scientific sense, because it's because it's hard to get funding for it. It's hard to tell your department chair that's what you do. It's hard to have it be above board, and so what we end up is stuff that festers like in darkness because we can't be above board about it. What else did we want to talk about on this like segment of the chapter?
I think what affects our perception on this topic, especially, I think it is very cultural, and I felt there was a part of the article that said that they had observed animals, and like rape rarely ever happens when it comes to like viewing that in nature somewhat, and I think it's just like our view of like consent and like how media somewhat affects that as well, because like he mentioned like it says like males get more like turned on by the idea of like the damsel in distress rather than a woman who's like willing to, and I think that's because of like the situations that are like skewed and portrayed in media, and like that's what we see rather than like the scientific evidence or the research that like we hardly ever get exposed to.
Yeah.
Well, going off of that, maybe I misread it. I thought it said that rape was found in apes, chimpanzees.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, ducks. It's actually, it's not super uncommon. I mean, we don't. how to put it? I don't know how to frame it in terms of actual, in general proportions, but it's not unheard of. And this includes both social animals like apes, as well as ones that are more solitary. So they're not all pair bonded kinds of animals that we find it in.
The duck example they gave I found to be really upsetting.
Yeah.
It was just to refresh, and for the listener, which sorry that you're now going to know this, but there was this idea that female like mallards will get gang raped to the point where they drown, and I thought that was just terrifying.
Yeah, and the thing is, this isn't like what happens occasionally. This is an accident, or like if you look in the reproductive tracts of female ducks, they have these long, like convoluted, almost like corkscrew-like shapes to their to the tract that's leading up to the ovaries. So so these are like anti-rape defenses that they've evolved. So this has happened over like a millennial time period that we're talking about now. So and in fact, and then actually these evolved responses they have to the changes in the reproductive tract result in fewer pregnancies as a result of rape, because as it turns out, they're able to kind of get these things. This sounds like such a red state excuse, but like ducks are able to actually kind of squeeze off the tracts that are going to, so it's going to prevent fertilization by other individuals that they don't want to be having intercourse with, but they'll be able to relax those for ones who they actually are attracted to, So, like again, not as an excuse, but to give a sense of this is what, to my mind, this is what the end point looks like when you have like historic rape over evolutionary timescales. There are all these things that will go into the category of what we call sexual conflict, whether it's about the time spent or energy spent for reproduction, or who gets diseases more frequently. All these things are kind of wrapped in males and females. Males and females in general have competing priorities, have competing demands. When we look at sexual conflict, we didn't talk a whole lot about this in class, but maybe in the future I'll do more with sexual conflict. So the other part that was included in this chapter was talking about homosexuality, and where it's found in a lot of places in animals, and certainly been a common feature of human experience. What do you want to pick apart on this?
One of the things that I found really interesting was, there were a couple of things about the homosexuality section that I thought was really interesting, but one of them was the idea that, inclusive fitness, that was the word. I couldn't find the word for a second. So rather than individual fitness, and rather than it being for the fitness of creating more offspring, it was inclusive fitness of like homosexuality only really being seen in social animals and social groups as a form of like social bonding. And I thought that was really interesting. And I also thought, which this is going to jump a little bit, sorry guys, but the other thing I found really interesting was the idea that when men were seen moving from animals to humans, or I guess humans are animals, but you know what I mean, men on the scale of homosexuality, it was either they were or they weren't, for the most part. And I think they said it, the comparison, the analogy they made was, it's like being right or left-handed. So it was like there were a couple people that were bisexual, but for the majority of male humans, it was either one or the other. And then for females, they compared it to like a height spectrum where you could fall anywhere in between homosexuality, heterosexuality, and bisexuality. And there didn't seem to be one area that was very strongly won out against the others. And I thought that was really interesting.
Well, going off of that, not necessarily as reading, but something that I learned in my gender studies class is a lot of what that has to do with is society's view on masculinity. And so for women, studies have shown that it's seen as attractive for a female to be attracted to another woman and that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of the time it's based on what is seen as attractive to the male. And it's also, from a masculinity point of view, seen as not masculine to be gay or not masculine to be a feminine male. So it's it's like not only I don't know, like a lot of what I read in the homosexuality point was a lot of these studies were seen as like straight to the point and not really sorry, I'm trying to not really
They didn't consider the other variables, maybe.
yeah.
Is it true? Although I'm thinking about the way you put that, and it got me thinking in terms of adaptive peaks, where guys are more successful in finding mates, either men or women, if they're at one end of the extreme or the other. But women's adaptive peak is not. It's like more toward the mean, and it can be in either. Like there's no particular particular like, unbeneficial place to be on that distribution. Huh. But talk more about inclusive fitness. So inclusive fitness, that's like that it's not just your individual, your reproductive output, but whoever else is in your group, whoever else is in your club. This is kind of fraught with ideas that go along with what's called group selection, which is an idea that kind of had its moment in evolution that's kind of been discounted. Still crops up in a couple of situations. Actually, in another recording, we're going to talk about how inclusive fitness might actually, group fitness might have something to do with the persistence of religious feelings in humans. But but in general, in evolution, we don't see a lot of evidence for group selection. Although there are vocal people who disagree with that. Yeah, what else do you want to talk about in the homosexuality part? And why was nothing talk about gender in this?
Well, because a lot of the time, it's in a science perspective, it's very confusing to talk about gender when talking about sex because gender is very. We don't know a lot about gender, and what we do is very confusing to the common person. And
There are a lot of things that are confusing to common people. Why can't we try to talk about it?
Well, I mean, and it's a lot of the time it can be very, like, just as you said, it's hard to study sex, it's hard to study gender because a lot of people don't understand it and it makes people very uncomfortable because they don't know a lot about it. And I found that this was trying to stick to a very scientific point, and they just didn't have any science to back up gender because it hasn't been properly studied.
I agree with that. Yeah, when reading this section, it says like our current research on like sexual orientation assumes essentialism right now. So like we assume that our categories for like sexual orientation can be like applied to people in any culture and at any point in history. And I think because of the new light of like gender most recently and just like in general, we can't like apply it right now. Or I think there are like differing views and we're also just like discovering more and like knowing more about it. So you couldn't really include it in the research just yet because like gender and history and like as well as different culture where like we might view things differently based on like religion or things like that. Like it might be a difficult one to tackle. Yeah.
Maybe. But actually, even thinking back now, when we were thinking about mate preferences, that was entirely like a hetero description, wasn't it? Yeah, so there really wasn't. So I feel like there are a bunch of things that could have been. I think it's a hard. I agree with you that it's a hard problem, but yeah, maybe that's just where the data are now, and that's what we can work with. What was just kind of a lightning round at the end here? Was there something that was like really surprising in this? Was there something that you would tell your roommate, or for the listener who hasn't read this chapter, what would be like? Was there one different thing or one take-home message that you got from this that you want to make sure that they own?
It was interesting to know that for homosexuality, there were significant genetic markers on males, but not on females. That was my big thing, was that you could look at the DNA and see where it was different in homosexual males, but there wasn't a marker like that in females, and that was my big takeaway.
Yeah, the whole newsy gay gene thing, it was a thing. But of course, we got to remember, I mean, just again, speaking of both as a human and as a scientist, like, we don't talk about genes for behaviors all
No,
the
it
time.
wasn't a gene for that. It was just...
But there were these associations, yeah.
Yeah, there was an association of if you had this marker, and then within that, the idea of... my word got cut off in the printout, but I believe it was monozygotic and...
Yes, digozotic, yeah.
Digozotic.
Mhm.
So, but with identical twins, when they came from the same egg, which, you know, is no surprise because they're genetically really similar, and the only difference really is epigenetics. But if one identical twin that was male was homosexual, the other one was really, really likely to also be homosexual. Whereas if that happened in females, it was less... It was about as likely as two regular siblings, rather than any other, like, association or correlation from being from the same egg.
You know, and that makes me think, knowing some other stuff, that makes me think how it's probably is genetically derived and, like, not hormonally derived. Because what can happen if you look in animals that have, like, litters, you know, where you can have, if you have 3 girl embryos together, the one in the middle is going to be like, it's going to have a higher dose of estrogens and other female hormones, female-related hormones that are just kind of circling around her. Then the one, and similarly, if there were 2 female embryos and a boy embryo, a male embryo in the middle, that one's going to tend to be like less masculinized or more feminized, just because of like what its local environment is like. For stuff that's for things that that hormones help to direct the building of, but for things that are genetically oriented, that's a really, because if you're in also identical twins are in the same amniotic sac, so that's why I was wondering if that has. If there's going to be some kind of hormonal difference there that could, or some other kind of protein product that ends up getting sent out, you know, and picked up by your roommate. But I know that you guys don't. I know that you guys know that genes are not equivalent to behaviors, are not equivalent even to most kinds of general morphologies. But just for the listener, certainly we got that one thing to take away from this is that we talk about genes related with things, but for most common behaviors that we're really interested in, or attributes of our bodies are really interested in, there aren't like single genes that are going to cause them. By and large, that kind of reductionism belongs on like the scrap heap of the 20th century. But you know, what else do you want to? Well, another take-home message. What do you have? Anything else you want to throw in?
I was actually going to mention that as well. I thought it was interesting that they had talked about, the gene correlation with the male homosexuality and how they said that lesbianism is entirely cultural. I thought that was interesting.
That was dropped and walked away from.
Yeah, they didn't back that up. They were just like, it's cultural.
Right.
Anyway, moving on. Like, next paragraph.
It's funny because so much of the MO of this book is to say, all right, here's where the standard social science model falls down. And then it says, well, lesbians, what are you going to do? You know, it was like, which was a very weird, just rhetorically very weird in the way that the way the rest of the chapter is written.
Right.
Sorry, I have to go back.
It's okay.
Another thing that I found interesting, and I was actually going to ask your opinion on, is in another one of my classes when I was talking about Athens, the idea of homosexuality and heterosexuality and bisexuality. They say it as it was like, they kind of phrase it as like it was a very open society. But the way that I've learned that in other classes is that it wasn't necessarily very open to that, but it was a system of power. A lot of the time when there was a homosexual relationship, it was between a man and a boy, and it was a symbol of power, and it was a symbol of a teacher and its student, and asserting that dominance over the student and kind of, in a way, trying to educate and turn that student into a future soldier or a future man. And the way that this kind of phrased it, it made it seem like it was a society that was very open to this fluid sexuality, and in what I've learned, it really wasn't. I mean, yes, there was homosexual relationships, but it wasn't like
It wasn't all the up and up here. Yeah. Huh.
It was very, like, power-based. The majority of it was between males instead of females. Of course, I mean, it brought up that there was, like, brothels and that kind of stuff, but that goes back to the idea of it being not necessarily for the benefit of the two women in the relationship, but the benefit of the man outside of the relationship, seeing that as attractive.
Yeah, now I think about it. So, like, yeah, contrast open access to brothels with. So for males, if we're gonna agree that this is an adaptation, this is a short-term mating, that's like, it seems like brothels would do that. But then, so like, what do you need the boys for? You know, like so I think the power argument makes as much sense as anything. So, yeah, but that's why I'm glad you guys read this, because you've taken other different classes than I have. So. Well, good. Well, I think we're about out of time, so everybody say goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening.
Toodles.